In Revelation chapter 19, verse 10, the last part, Jesus Christ is pictured as saying, "For the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy." Today we see world events cascading around us in every form. We see Bible prophecy definitely being set up for the final fulfillment in the Middle East. President George Bush called for a ceasefire in the United Nations Iraqi conflict. Of course, this ceasefire is based upon whether Iraq submits to the 12 resolutions presented by the United Nations organization. And apparently George Bush believes that he will, because they are now bringing troops home. Whether Iraq fulfills all 12 resolutions or not remains to be seen. President Bush has pushed the fact that the United States was fighting under the auspices and direction of the United Nations organization. He also stated that no nation would rise again against the family of nations, because now, as a direct result of the Iraqi crisis, the world is now united and no one will stand against it anymore. But the question is the world really united? Or is the power structure of the Illuminati nearly in place to bring about world government through force? Why would the President of the United States want to strengthen the United Nations organization? Why? So that it would become sovereign over us, and so that we would no longer have the freedoms that we have in this country. What did he mean when he said that the United Nations now had a chance to become what its founders envisioned? So the question I have today is, what did they envision, and what is the truth of the United Nations and the new order, new world order that George Bush is calling for? President Bush has now called for a new world order under the authority of the United Nations. In an address he gave January 17th, I will quote what was found in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch the next day. Quote, "This is an historic moment. We have in this past year made great progress in ending the long era of conflict and Cold War." Of course, he meant with the Soviet Union. "We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order. A world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful," and notice how emphatic he was, he said, "and we will be. We have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the United Nations founders." End of quote. In Revelation of your Bible, chapter 13, I want to start in verse 1. It says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard. His feet were as the feet of a bear, his mouth as the mouth of a lion, and the dragon gave him his power, and his seat and great authority." So Satan the devil is giving rise to this end-time system. You'll notice that this end-time system will have all the characteristics of the beast powers before it. Babylon, Medo-Persian Empire, the Greco-Macedonian Empire, and the Roman Empire. This one will have all of those combined. How could that be? Because we have the modern technology to fulfill all the characteristics of those beasts. Then it discusses that this beast ahead of it was wounded. But then all the world wondered after the beast because this wound was healed. And we saw that the Roman Empire collapsed. There has not been a world ruling government since that time. And now, all of a sudden, in the latter part of the 20th century, there is a push for world government once again. Verse 4, "They worship the dragon." That's because the dragon has deceived the whole world and has brought about Mystery Babylon the Great, a religious system. And it states once again that it was this dragon, or Satan the devil, that gave power to the beast. And they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like unto the beast?" So when this system rises, they're going to be astonished. The whole world is going to jump for joy, you might say, because no longer will there be wars. Didn't President Bush state very clearly that no nation would ever rise again like Iraq and enforce itself upon little tiny Kuwait? Who was able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and them that dwell in heaven. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. So there is coming a government that is going to make war with you and I and every other Christian on the face of the earth. It's going to happen. It's inevitable. It's etched in the Bible, and God does not and cannot lie. His character is perfect, and he lives by the 10 Commandments of your Bible. There was a phrase batted around in 1945. That phrase was the last hope of mankind, the only way to protect mankind from the horrors of war. This phrase was talking about the United Nations organization. This banner was put out in the newspapers, radio, in the media. Only a few of us were alive at that time and can remember those things. Most of us were young or yet to be born. But the internationalist government known as the United Nations organization was sold to the American people in 1945 under that banner, the last hope of mankind. You'll notice when the United Nations was founded, there was nothing said about God. There was nothing said about the gospel, the good news that the God of heaven would set up a kingdom that would never be destroyed. God does not even enter into the picture. There is nothing supernatural on the surface by those promoting the United Nations organization. Only behind the scene, and those who are in control of the Illuminati worship the devil and Lucifer. One thing I would like to establish in talking about this end-time government that will rule the United Nations is that the aim and the goal of the United Nations are diametrically and irreversibly opposed to the best interest of the United States and the American people. The best interest for the American people is the free enterprise system where anyone can go out into the workforce, earn a living, and can climb up through the ranks to whatever standard they want. And yet this new government is going to impose something totally different. The ultimate goal of the United Nations is to do away with the Constitution of the United States and our sovereignty, and to merge this great nation into a one-world socialistic community with the Soviet Union and China. To be exact, those who are now working toward taking our sovereignty away and merging us into a community of nations have already established a pattern way back so that they could at least try and perfect their system before they take control of the whole world. They overthrew Russia and China and imposed their socialistic program upon them, and when they saw that it failed, then they adjusted the system. And so now they know they must meet the United States partway in a controlled free enterprise system in order to make it work. A Dr. Carroll Quigley stated in his book, Tragedy and Hope, on page 324, and I quote, "Their aim is nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. The system was to be controlled in a feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world acting in concert." That's consistent agreement with one another, by secret agreements arrived at in frequent meetings and conferences. End of quote. Have you ever heard of an organization called the Bilderbergers? This is made up primarily of international bankers by which they meet and formulate the policy, economic policy for the world for the next 6 months. An Associated Press release on July 26th of 1968 stated the following, I quote, New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller, remember the Rockefeller family controls Citicorp, the largest bank in the United States. They also control other banks, Chase Manhattan Bank in New York City, both international banking firms, both a part of the New World Order. They own stock in the Federal Reserve System, which is their central bank to control the United States. He said, I'll continue the quote, New York Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller says as president he would work toward international creation of a new world order. End of quote. So we can see that there are very influential people who are working for the New World Order and behind the scenes, and it did not even become open until the latter part of the 60s and the middle part of the 1970s, when they felt they had so much control that they could not lose their position of world government. The Declaration of Interdependence was signed by 32 senators and 92 representatives. Now this is very important because you must understand that every representative and every senator that goes to Washington, D.C. swears to uphold the Constitution of the United States. That means not the United Nations Charter. And yet every single time a new person goes to the United States Congress, they find out that we have now made a treaty with the United Nations organization, and treaties override the Constitution of the United States, and the Charter of the United Nations becomes supreme law of the land. And no longer can they pass laws according to the Constitution. It must be according to the Charter of the United Nations that puts us into a world government. This was signed January 30th, 1976. It reads in part, and I quote, 2 centuries ago, our forefathers brought forth a new nation. Now we must join with others, that's others, the nations of the world, to bring forth a new world order. End of quote. That was found in the Review of the News, March 3rd, 1976, page 38. According to the Seattle Post-Intelligence, on April 18th, 1975, Henry Kissinger is reported to have said, and I quote, our nation is uniquely endowed to play a creative and decisive role in the new order which is taking form around us. End of quote. Page A2. President George Bush gave the commencement address at Texas A&M University on May 12th of 1989. The subject he chose to talk about was Soviet-American relations. He said, and I quote, ultimately, our objective is to welcome the Soviet Union back into the world order. Perhaps the world order of the future will truly be a family of nations. End of quote. That came from the Arizona Daily Star, May 12th, 1989. So we can see from various individuals, they're all talking about a new world order. And in every case, they're always promoting the United Nations organization as that super state that will oversee all other states. A Colonel Edward Mandell House, which I've talked about so many times, was the right hand of President Woodrow Wilson. He had a hidden agenda in getting the United States into the World War I. Historian Walter Mills said the following, quote, the Colonel's sole justification for preparing such a batch of blood, that was World War I and the loss of life, for his countrymen was his hope of establishing a new world order of peace and security. End of quote. That was found in the American Opinion magazine, January 1976, page 91. There are other people who have talked about the New World Order. I've mentioned before the April 1974 issue of Foreign Affairs published by the Council on Foreign Relations, how one of their writers, Richard Gardner, from one of the schools up in the Northeast, stated very clearly that we needed to erode the Constitution of the United States piece by piece and merge us into a world government.